Hey guys, tonight I want you to do something for me before we settle in. I want you to picture a farmhouse on the prairie, not the one from the television show with its perfect lighting and its cheerful music. The real one. The one where the floorboards creaked in winter, where the lamp oil smelled of kerosene and smoke, where 5 children grew up in rooms so small that 3 of them shared a single bed. The one where Caroline Ingalls kept her kitchen spotless despite having no running water. The one where Charles played his fiddle on evenings when the work was done, and the worry could wait until morning. That farmhouse stood in De Smet, Dakota Territory, and later in Mansfield, Missouri. You can visit one of them today. You can walk through the rooms where Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote her books in pencil on school tablets. You can stand in the kitchen Caroline designed herself, built to the height of a woman who was not tall. You can see the photographs on the walls, the desk, the rocking chair, the quilt. But there is something you will not find in that house. No matter how carefully you search, you will not find any evidence of Albert Quinn Ingalls. You will not find James and Cassandra Cooper Ingalls. You will not find Nancy, because they were never there. Charles and Caroline Ingalls had 5 children, and every single one of them was born to them. Mary in 1865, Laura in 1867, Carrie in 1870, a son named Charles Frederick in 1875, who lived only 9 months before he died, and Grace in 1877. 5 children across 12 years, all of them documented in census records, in family letters, in photographs, in the books Laura would later write. Not one of them was adopted. Yet if you grew up watching Little House on the Prairie on NBC between 1974 and 1983, you know the names Albert, James, Cassandra, and Nancy, as well as you know the names of the real Ingalls children. You remember Albert's struggles with addiction. You remember the tragedy of James and Cassandra losing their parents in a wagon accident. You remember Nancy's arrival as the Olsons' spoiled adopted daughter. You remember these children as part of the Ingalls family story, but they are not part of the story. They are part of something else entirely. Something that tells us as much about American television in the 1970s and 1980s as it does about the American frontier in the 1870s and 1880s. Something that reveals how easily a myth can replace reality when the myth is more dramatic, more emotionally satisfying, more designed to make you cry on a Wednesday night at 8 o'clock. Tonight, we're going to walk through that replacement. We're going to meet the children who never existed. We're going to understand why television needed them, why millions of viewers believed in them, and why the gap between what Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote and what Michael Landon's writers created has become one of the most fascinating case studies in how America rewrites its own history. Before we meet the invented children, we need to meet the real ones. The Ingalls family that exists in the historical record is smaller than the television family, harder pressed, and far more mobile than most people imagine. Charles and Caroline married in 1860 in Wisconsin, back when the Civil War had not yet started and the Dakota Territory was still being surveyed. They started their married life in a log cabin in the big woods of Wisconsin, the same cabin Laura would later make famous in her first book. Their first child, Mary Amelia Ingalls, was born on January 10th, 1865, in the middle of winter. The war was ending. Lincoln had just been re-elected. Somewhere in the forests of Wisconsin, a young mother held her first baby and understood that this was what her life would be now. Children, work, survival. The next baby, Laura Elizabeth Ingalls, arrived 2 years later on February 7th, 1867. Then Caroline Celestia, called Carrie, in 1870. The Ingalls family stayed in Wisconsin until the early 1870s, when Charles's restlessness pulled them west. They moved to Kansas, where they built a log cabin on Osage land and lived for about a year before government policy forced them to leave. They moved back to Wisconsin, then to Minnesota, where they settled near Walnut Grove, and where, for a brief time, things seemed to stabilize. In November 1875, Caroline gave birth to a son, Charles Frederick Ingalls, called Freddie, the only boy, the only son Charles and Caroline would ever have. He lived for 9 months and 26 days. He died on August 27, 1876, at the home of his uncle Peter Ingalls in Zumbro Falls, Minnesota, while the family was between moves. The cause is not certain. Some sources suggest it was a sudden illness. Others point to the possibility of a birth defect that took time to manifest. What is certain is that the family buried him, and Caroline carried that loss for the rest of her life. 2 years later, in 1877, she gave birth to another daughter, Grace Pearl Ingalls, the youngest child, the one who would close the circle. Mary, Laura, Carrie, Freddie, Grace. That is the list. That is the complete set. And when Laura sat down in her 60s to write about her childhood, she wrote about those children and no others. She did not write about adopted siblings. She did not write about foster children who stayed with the family for long periods. She wrote about the 5 children Caroline and Charles brought into the world and about the one they buried before he could walk. The census records confirm this. The 1870 census in Wisconsin lists Charles, Caroline, Mary, Laura, and Carrie. The 1880 census in South Dakota lists Charles, Caroline, Mary, Laura, Carrie, and Grace. Freddie does not appear in any federal census because he was born and died between census years, but he appears in family letters, in Laura's unpublished autobiography Pioneer Girl, and in the family memory. No other children appear, not in the census, not in the letters, not in the land records, not in the homestead documents, not in the school enrollment lists, not in the church registries, not anywhere. But on September 18th, 1978, during the 5th season of A Little House on the Prairie, a boy named Albert Quinn Ingalls appeared on television. He was an orphan living on the streets of Winoka, a city where Charles and Caroline had temporarily moved for work. He was scrappy, resourceful, and clearly in need of a family. Charles took an interest in him. Caroline opened her heart to him. By the end of the season, they had adopted him. Albert Quinn Ingalls, played by Matthew Labyorteaux, became, in the minds of millions of viewers, the son Charles Ingalls never had in real life. Except Charles Ingalls did have a son in real life, Freddie, the boy who died at 9 months old, the boy whose loss Laura largely left out of her published books. Scholars have suggested the grief was simply too raw, too much a part of Caroline's silent mourning to render into children's literature. Television replaced that grief with a redemption story. The show did not mention Freddie. It created Albert instead. A boy who could be saved. A boy who could grow up. A boy whose storylines could include addiction, illness, first love, moral struggles, and all the dramatic weight that a long-running series needed to keep viewers invested. Albert's introduction was not an accident. It was a calculated decision by the show's producers, who understood that the original child actors were aging out of their roles. Melissa Sue Anderson, who played Mary, was in her late teens and her character's storyline was shifting toward her life as a blind teacher. Melissa Gilbert, who played Laura, was entering young adulthood. The show needed new children, new innocence, new vulnerability. So, they invented Albert. And because the show had already spent 4 seasons convincing viewers that it was telling the true story of Laura Ingalls Wilder's family, many viewers assumed Albert was part of that true story. Letters arrived at NBC asking about Albert's later life. Fan clubs formed around the character. People visited the Laura Ingalls Wilder Museum in Mansfield, Missouri, and asked the staff about the adopted son. The staff had to explain over and over that Albert never existed. But by then, the replacement was complete. In the popular imagination, Albert Ingalls was as real as Laura Ingalls. The television family had overwritten the historical family in a way that no amount of archival correction could fully undo. And Albert was only the beginning. In May 1981, during the show's 7th season, the writers introduced James and Cassandra Cooper in a 2-part episode called The Lost Ones. Charles and Albert were accompanying the Cooper family, parents Alvin and Sarah, and their 2 children, on a delivery run. When the group reached a steep hill, Charles and Alvin agreed to take the descent one wagon at a time, leaving the children behind with the Ingalls wagon. Something went wrong. Alvin lost control. The wagon crashed at the bottom of the hill and both Alvin and Sarah were killed instantly. Their children watched it happen. James and Cassandra became orphans. Charles and Caroline, who had already adopted Albert by this point in the show's timeline, took them in. The two siblings were eventually adopted by the Ingalls family and became James and Cassandra Cooper Ingalls. The episode was heartbreaking, beautifully acted and completely fictional. There were no Alvin and Sarah Cooper in the historical record. There was no wagon accident in Walnut Grove in the 1880s that left two children orphaned and in need of the Ingalls family's care. There were no siblings named James and Cassandra who joined the family. The actors who played them, Jason Bateman and Melissa Francis, have gone on to successful adult careers. Bateman became one of Hollywood's most recognisable actors. Francis became a financial news anchor. But the characters they played on Little House on the Prairie existed only on television, not in history, not in Laura's books, not in the farmhouse in De Smet or the one in Mansfield, only on a soundstage in California, in front of cameras, in a version of the Ingalls family that had been constructed to maximise emotional impact and viewer loyalty. And then there was Nancy. Nancy was introduced after Nellie Olson, the show's longtime antagonist, married and left Walnut Grove. The character of Nellie had been a composite creation from the start. Laura's books mentioned several different girls who bullied her, and the show combined them into one memorable villain. When actress Alison Arngrim left the series, the writers needed a replacement antagonist, someone spoiled, someone difficult, someone the audience could love to hate. So, they had the Olsons adopt a girl named Nancy. Nancy was written as the opposite of everything the adoption storyline is supposed to represent. While Albert's adoption arc emphasised redemption and love, and James and Cassandra's story emphasised family healing, Nancy's storyline leaned into every ugly stereotype about adopted children. She was manipulative, she was ungrateful, she was cruel to the other children. She was, in the show's framing, proof that some children could not be saved even by the best parents. It was a troubling message then, and it remains troubling now. And like Albert, like James and Cassandra, Nancy had no basis in reality. The Olsons were real people, or rather, they were based on a real shopkeeper family Laura had known in Walnut Grove, but they did not adopt any children. The Nancy character was invented purely for plot convenience, to fill a narrative gap left by another character's departure. 4 invented children: Albert, James, Cassandra, Nancy. 4 lives that millions of people believed were real, because a television show in the 1970s and 1980s presented them as part of the Ingalls family story. But here is what the television show did not tell you. The real Ingalls family was too poor to adopt children. That is not a dramatic statement. It is not meant to diminish Charles and Caroline's generosity or their capacity for love. It is simply a fact. The Ingalls family spent decades on the edge of financial survival. They moved constantly, chasing better land, better opportunities, and steadier work. They lost crops to weather. They lost homes to debt. They took in boarders when they needed extra income. Caroline sewed for money. Charles worked as a day labourer, a carpenter, a grain elevator manager, whatever would pay enough to keep the family fed. Laura herself left school at 15 to work as a teacher, sending her wages home to help cover the cost of Mary's education at the Iowa College for the Blind. They could not afford to take in extra children. The television show, with its comfortable farmhouse and its well-stocked table, and its sense of frontier prosperity, erased the economic precarity that defined the real Ingalls family's existence. It created a version of Charles and Caroline who had enough resources, enough stability, enough margin to adopt not just 1 child but 3. It made them into frontier saints, endlessly capable of absorbing more need, more mouths to feed, more lives to shelter. It made them into something they were not. And in doing so, it made their real lives smaller, less impressive, less worth remembering. Because the truth is this: Charles and Caroline Ingalls raised 5 children on the American frontier with almost no safety net. They moved those children through Wisconsin, Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, and South Dakota, always searching for the stability that never quite arrived. They educated those children in one-room schoolhouses. They kept those children alive through blizzards, through scarlet fever, through diphtheria, through the grinding poverty that was the norm for most frontier families. They did all of this while grieving a son who died in infancy. That is the real story. That is the story Laura Ingalls Wilder spent her 60s and 70s writing down in pencil on school tablets, alone at a desk in a Missouri farmhouse. 8 books, from Little House in the Big Woods in 1932 to these happy golden years in 1943. None of them include adopted children, foster children, or any long-term members of the household beyond the 5 biological siblings. The census pages, the family letters, the homestead documents, and the scholarly literature, including the Pioneer Girl Project's annotated edition of Laura's original manuscript, published in 2014, and Caroline Fraser's Prairie Fires, published in 2017, all confirm the same thing. The Ingalls family as it existed on the American frontier consisted of Charles, Carolyn, and 5 biological children. And that story, the true one, was extraordinary enough without inventing additional children to make it more dramatic for television. But television does not trust true stories to be dramatic enough on their own. So, it invents. So, it rewrites. So it takes a historical family and adds characters who never existed, and airs those characters in prime time for nearly a decade, and waits for a generation of viewers to grow up believing that the invented family is the real one. And here we are in 2026, still sorting out the difference. Tonight we are going to walk through every invented child. We are going to meet them on television's terms first, understanding what the show gave them, personalities, struggles, storylines that mattered to millions of viewers. We are going to treat them with the respect their fictional existence deserves, because they were part of something that genuinely moved people. But then we're going to meet the real Ingalls children, the 5 who actually lived, the 5 whose lives were harder and stranger, and more interesting than any television writer could have scripted. The 5 who grew up in a family that was always one bad harvest away from losing everything, and who somehow survived, and who became teachers and homesteaders, and in Laura's case, one of the most widely read authors in American history. And we are going to ask the question that sits at the centre of this entire story. Why did America need the Ingalls family to have adopted children? What does it say about us that we could not accept the real family as impressive enough? What does it say about how we understand the frontier, about how we imagine generosity, about how we construct our heroes, that we required Charles and Carolyn Ingalls to be not just good parents, but adoptive parents? Not just survivors, but rescuers. Not just a struggling farm family, but an endless well of compassion and resources. The answer to that question is going to take us through 9 seasons of television, through 80 years of American myth-making, through the difference between what Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote and what Michael Landon's writers dramatised, and through the archives, the census records, the family letters, the photographs, that prove, beyond any doubt, that the Ingalls family never adopted anyone. This is the story of the children who never were, and it starts with a boy in a blue coat. He is standing on a street corner in a town called Winoka, waiting for Charles Ingalls to notice him. A boy who, in the real history of the American frontier, was never born. And here is where it gets fascinating, because in 1978, something happened that would permanently rewrite the way millions of Americans understood who Charles and Caroline Ingalls were. Not in a book, not in a museum, on television. On a Wednesday night, on NBC, in a primetime slot that Little House regularly drew audiences in the range of 30 million viewers during its peak seasons, at times reaching nearly half of all television switched on in America. Michael Landon had a problem. The show had been running for 4 seasons. Melissa Sue Anderson, who played Mary, had aged out of the childhood storylines. The Ingalls children were growing up in real time, right there on screen, and the writers were running out of road with the existing family structure. You cannot keep writing the same family dynamics once the children become young adults. You cannot keep the emotional core of a show about family life if the family itself stops needing a father to hold it together. So Landon did something bold. He invented a son. Not loosely based on a real person, not inspired by a vague historical account. He created a character from the ground up, gave him a name, gave him a history, gave him a face, and wove him into the fabric of a story that millions of people believed was, in its essential bones, true. The character's name was Albert Quinn Ingalls, and the reason Landon chose the name Albert deserves a moment of quiet attention, Ysuster because it is one of the most genuinely human details in the entire production history of this show. In an interview, Melissa Gilbert, who played Laura, explained that Albert was named for a real boy. Not a fictional one, a real boy named Albert Muscatel, the firstborn son of Landon's close friends Eleanor and Ray. Albert Muscatel had been 18 or 19 years old, riding his bicycle home one evening when he was struck by a car and killed. Michael Landon created the character of Albert Ingalls as a tribute to that boy. Sit with that for a moment. A grieving friend pouring his loss into a television show watched by 30 million people named a fictional character after a real boy who died too young, and in doing so he accidentally created one of the most persistent myths in the history of American popular culture. The myth that Charles and Carolyn Ingalls, the real ones, the ones who actually lived and breathed and farmed and struggled across the American frontier, were the most famous adoptive parents in 19th century history. They were not. They never were. But the story was going to take a long time to untangle. In Season 5 of Little House on the Prairie, which began airing in 1978, the Ingalls family found themselves in a fictional town called Winoka. The move was motivated within the show's logic by Mary's enrollment in the blind school there. And it was in Winoka, not Walnut Grove, not anywhere that appears in Laura Ingalls Wilder's actual books, or in the historical record of the real family's movements, that a boy named Albert Quinn appeared. He was 10 years old on screen. He was scrappy, unwashed, surviving on his own in the way that orphaned children in Victorian-era popular fiction always survive, through cunning and petty theft and the kind of desperate resourcefulness that makes an audience root for them immediately. Laura caught him stealing newspapers and money from the hotel where Charles worked. Charles let him go, then caught him stealing again a lantern from a store. And instead of turning him in, Charles Ingalls, played by Michael Landon with the particular warmth that was his signature on this show, bought the boy the lantern. Just bought it. Because that is the kind of father Charles Ingalls was supposed to be. Not the kind who punishes, the kind who understands. Albert was brought to Mary's birthday party, introduced as Charles's friend, and eventually returned with the family to Walnut Grove. He ran away more than once. He tested the patience of the household in more than one season. He searched for his biological father in a school genealogy project, and it was during that project, in a Season 6 episode titled The Family Tree, those things came to a head. Albert's biological father, a man named Mr. Quinn, appeared and sought custody of him. Albert pretended to be blind to dissuade him. The ruse worked. Mr. Quinn walked away, and Charles and Caroline formally adopted Albert, making him Albert Quinn Ingalls in the eyes of the show's fictional world. Matthew Labiauteau, born December 8th, 1966, played the role from 1978 through 1983. He was, by every account that has survived, an extraordinarily gifted young actor, and the character he played was written with real complexity. An orphaned boy wrestling with identity, belonging, addiction, and the specific grief of a child who has learned that the people who are supposed to protect him cannot always be trusted to do so. The audience loved him, and they believed him. This is the part of the story that the historical record makes almost impossible to fully reckon with, because the emotional truth of the character was so persuasively constructed that it overrode the factual truth of the family. For millions of viewers, especially for the women who watched this show week after week and felt the Ingalls family as something close to their own family, Albert was real. Albert had always been real. Albert was Charles's son, the same way Mary was his daughter and Laura was his daughter. The same way the prairie itself was real, and the fiddle music was real, and the particular quality of the light in the opening credits, the little girl running down the hill with her bonnet flying behind her, was real. But open any census record from the Ingalls household, any land record, any family letter, any account left by a neighbour or a church member or a local historian in any of the towns where the Ingalls actually lived. Albert is not there. He was never there. Now, here is the thing that makes this story more than just a case of television taking liberties with history, because television always takes liberties. That is its job. The interesting question is not whether the show departed from the books. Of course it did, significantly and repeatedly, especially in the later seasons when it had outrun the source material entirely. The interesting question is why these particular departures, the adopted children, lodged themselves so deeply in the public memory that they became indistinguishable from fact. The answer has everything to do with how the show was positioned in American culture. Little House on the Prairie was not marketed as historical fiction in the way that, say, a costume drama about ancient Rome is marketed as historical fiction. It was marketed as something closer to documented memory. Based on the beloved books by Laura Ingalls Wilder, True Family, Real Frontier, the opening credits showed actual prairie landscapes. The sets were carefully designed to evoke the material culture of the 1870s and 1880s Midwest. The show had an air of authenticity. The mud, the rough-hewn timber, the hand-stitched clothing, the kerosene lamps, that made it easy, almost inevitable for viewers to assume that if it looked this real, it must be this real. And within that visual framework of carefully constructed authenticity, Albert walked in from Winoka. The discrepancy between looking real and being real is one of the most powerful forces in television history, and Little House exploited it. Not cynically, but sincerely, which almost makes it more effective. Landon was not trying to deceive anyone. He genuinely believed in the family he was creating on screen. He was pouring his own grief for a dead boy into a story about what it means to save a child, and he told that story with the full force of his considerable talents. The result was a character that felt true in every way that mattered to an audience watching from a living room in 1978. The only way it did not feel true was in the archives, and most people do not visit archives. 3 years after Albert arrived, the writers went back to the well. Season 7, May 1981. A 2-part episode called The Lost Ones. James and Cassandra Cooper were the children of Alvin and Sarah Cooper, a family travelling by wagon when an accident occurred. The wagon tumbled down a steep hill. Their parents died. The 2 children, James, 12 years old, and Cassandra, 8, were left orphaned in a single afternoon. The show tried to find alternatives before landing the children with Charles and Carolyn. An elderly uncle named Jed, who worked as a miner, was located but was deemed too old to raise 2 children alone. The Sleepy Eye Orphanage could not take them. The blind school could not take them. And Charles Ingalls, as he always did, could not bear to let a child be abandoned when there was something he could do about it. He and Caroline took them in. The children were played by Jason Bateman as James. Yes, that Jason Bateman, who would later become one of the most recognizable actors in American film and television, and by Melissa Francis as Cassandra. And like Albert before them, James and Cassandra Cooper have no counterpart anywhere in the historical record of the real Ingalls family. No census record, no family letter, no mention in any account from any town where Charles and Caroline Ingalls actually lived. They were born in a writer's room in the early 1980s, the children of a production need rather than a mother and father. The production need, according to retrospective accounts, was partly practical. Melissa Sue Anderson had left the series. The show needed a way to maintain a child-centered family dynamic around Charles as a continuing father figure. James and Cassandra provided that. They were young enough to need parenting. They were photogenic. They were tragic in the precise way that television tragedy requires. Sudden, clean, with identifiable victims and a clear emotional arc. The audience accepted them, though with rather more ambivalence than they had accepted Albert. By 1981, several years into the later seasons of the show, viewers were already beginning to sense that the Ingalls family they were watching had drifted quite far from the family they had first met. The adoption of James and Cassandra accelerated that feeling. The show was becoming something different from what it had been, but the mythology was still building. The idea of Charles and Caroline as people who simply could not say no to a child in need was by now firmly established. 2 adoptions confirmed a pattern. A pattern became a truth. And the truth, the fictional one, the televised one, burrowed itself into the collective memory of a generation. Then came Nancy. If Albert was the heart of the adoption mythology, and James and Cassandra were its expansion, Nancy was its acknowledgement of its own artifice. The original Nellie Olson, petty, spoiled, endlessly scheming, the perfect foil to Laura's frontier virtue, had married and left Walnut Grove. Nellie was played by Alice Narngrim, who would later become one of the most eloquent and sharp-witted commentators on the Little House phenomenon, in interviews and in her memoir. When Nellie left, the show felt the absence immediately. The Olsen household without a difficult child was missing something essential. The dynamic that had given the show much of its friction for years was gone. So, the Olsens adopted a replacement. Beginning in Season 8, Nancy was played by Alison Balson, and she was designed with what appears in retrospect to be almost surgical precision to reproduce the function Nellie had served. The spoiled antagonist, the entitled troublemaker, the foil that made Laura's goodness shine brighter by contrast. She was not based on any historical child. She was not inspired by any real Olsen family member. She was a narrative device wearing the face of an adopted daughter. And here is where the story takes a turn that is less charming and considerably more troubling than anything Albert's addiction arc or James and Cassandra's wagon accident could produce. Because Nancy's adoption storyline did something that the earlier adoptions had at least avoided. It used adoption as a framework for a child villain. The structure of the narrative implied, in the ways that television narrative always implies things without stating them directly, that adopted children carry something unpredictable in them. That you take in an orphan and you might get Albert, troubled but salvageable, ultimately grateful and loving. Or you might get Nancy, ungrateful, manipulative, impossible. The Ingalls were lucky. The Olsens got what the Olsens deserved. Scholars who have written about the later seasons of Little House have noted this troubling undercurrent in the adoption narratives. The show that had spent years celebrating the nobility of taking in orphan children simultaneously constructed a storyline in which the wrong child being adopted by the wrong family was presented as both comic and punishing. None of this was the intention of the writers, who were working under the ordinary pressures of network television, ratings, character arcs, the need to generate conflict across 20-plus episodes a season. But intentions and effects are different things, and the effect was a mythology of adoption that was more complicated and more ideologically loaded than it first appeared. Now step back from all of it, Albert, James and Cassandra, Nancy, and look at what had happened to the Ingalls family by the time the show ended in 1983. In Laura Ingalls Wilder's books, Charles and Caroline Ingalls have 5 biological children. Mary, Laura, Carrie, baby Freddie, who died before his first birthday, and Grace. That is the family. Clearly documented, cross-referenced across census records and family letters, and Wilder's own handwritten manuscripts and the published novels. 5 children, all biological, all accounted for. In the NBC television series, that same Charles and Carolyn Ingalls acquired, over the course of 9 seasons, 3 adopted children, Albert, James and Cassandra, plus a tangentially related adoption story in the Olsen household involving Nancy. The Ingalls family the television audience said goodbye to in 1983 was not the Ingalls family that history documented. It was not even the Ingalls family that Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote about in 8 books across 11 years. It was the Ingalls family that Michael Landon and a team of television writers had built around the emotional needs of an audience and the practical demands of a primetime drama. Both versions became real to the people who loved them. And this is the cruelest and most interesting part of the story. Neither version is complete without understanding the other. There is something important to understand about why the television adoptions landed with the particular force that they did, especially on the women who made up the show's core audience. The 1970s and 1980s were not a simple time for American families. Divorce rates had climbed significantly through the 1970s. The cultural certainties about what a family was supposed to look like — mother, father, biological children, stable home — were being renegotiated in ways that felt destabilizing to many people, especially women who had built their lives around a particular model of domesticity that the outside world was no longer fully endorsing. Little House on the Prairie offered something that very few other shows of its era could offer, a family that held. Not easily, not without conflict. The show was never without conflict, But Charles and Caroline held. They held through poverty and through illness and through the death of a child and through crop failures and through the specific terror of raising children in a world that does not reliably protect them. They held. And when they extended that holding outward, when they took in Albert, when they took in James and Cassandra, they were performing for an audience of millions the most powerful fantasy that the era could provide, the fantasy that a family can expand to include whoever needs it. That love is a resource that does not run out, that the right parents can save a child that the world has failed. This was enormously appealing to the women watching, not because it was naive, because it was hopeful, because in a decade when so many things that were supposed to be permanent were proving fragile, here was a family that kept choosing, over and over, to be bigger rather than smaller. The fact that Charles and Caroline Ingalls had never, in actual documented history, made those choices, that was not information the audience had access to. And even if they had, it is not entirely clear that it would have changed the emotional impact of what they were watching. But here is where we have to be honest about what was lost. Because every time the television show gave Charles and Caroline another child to save, it was also, in a quiet and unremarked upon way, writing over the story of what the real Ingalls family's limitations had looked like. The real Charles and Caroline Ingalls were not people who had unlimited capacity to take in the children of others. They were people who were, for significant portions of their adult lives, struggling to feed the children they already had. The research of Caroline Fraser in Prairie Fires documents with considerable specificity just how precarious the Ingalls family's finances were through the 1870s and 1880s, the years the show was depicting on screen. The crops failed. The grasshoppers came and ate everything. The family moved again and again, not out of adventurousness but out of desperation, because the land they were on was not producing enough to sustain them. Charles Ingalls was not a failed man. He was a man living on the hard edge of subsistence, making choices under constraints that the show's warm palette of amber light and fiddle music consistently softened. A family operating on that margin does not take in orphans, not out of cruelty, out of arithmetic. The television show replaced that arithmetic with something warmer and more comforting. It took a family that was barely keeping its own children fed and turned them into a family that always had room for one more. And in doing so, it created a version of frontier family life that was emotionally satisfying and historically misleading at the same time. The real frontier, the one in the census records and the land claims and the letters that survive in archives, was a place where people were far more often on the receiving end of community support than the giving end, where the charity ran in both directions and where the line between the family that was saving children and the family that needed saving was thinner than the show ever suggested. There is one more thread in this part of the story that deserves careful attention before we move forward. The show's invented adoptions did not just affect how audiences understood the Ingalls family, they affected, in ways that are harder to measure but no less real, how adoption itself was understood by the millions of children and adults who grew up watching Little House on the Prairie as their primary narrative framework for what adoption looked like. For a generation of viewers, the template was Charles Ingalls kneeling in the mud of Winoka to talk to a 10-year-old boy who had been stealing to survive. The template was a big-hearted pioneer father who saw a child that the world had abandoned and decided, without hesitation, without paperwork, without the machinery of state welfare systems, that this child was his now. That image is not entirely without value. It carries within it something genuine about the moral aspiration of parenthood. The idea that family is not simply biology, but choice. But it is also, when held up against the actual history of 19th century frontier child welfare, profoundly simplified. In the real American frontier of the 1870s and 1880s, informal fostering and the taking in of orphaned or abandoned children did occur. It was part of the fabric of rural community life in an era before formalized child welfare systems. But it was overwhelmingly transactional in ways the show never depicted. Children were taken into work. They contributed to household labor in exchange for food and shelter. The warm, full, emotional adoption that Charles Ingalls offers Albert, The legal adoption, the name change, and the complete integration into the family as a full and equal member was far rarer and far more complicated in practice than the show suggested. None of this is to say that real frontier families were cold. They were not. But they were human, which means they were operating under material constraints as well as emotional ones. The show removed the material constraints entirely and left only the emotional aspiration. The result was beautiful. It was also, as a historical document, incomplete. By the time Little House on the Prairie ended its original run in 1983, 3 generations of fictional children had been folded into the Ingalls family mythology. Albert had survived addiction and was later diagnosed with leukemia in the television movie that followed the series. Look back to yesterday, a storyline that left his ultimate fate deliberately ambiguous. James and Cassandra had gradually become less central as the show aged. Nancy had served her purpose as a Nellie surrogate and faded, but the mythology they created did not fade with them. It compounded with the books. It compounded with the reruns, which have run somewhere in the world, on some channel, in some language, for every year since 1974. It compounded with the Laura Ingalls Wilder museums and home sites, which focus on the books and the historical family, but exist in a cultural landscape so saturated with the television show that visitors often arrive unable to entirely separate the two. It compounded with the classroom curriculum of the 1980s and 1990s. When the books were required reading in American elementary schools, and the television show was what children watched on weekend afternoons, the fictional adopted children became part of the Ingalls story, the way that myths always become part of histories, quietly, gradually, without any single moment of conversion, until the question is no longer whether Albert was real, but why it feels wrong to say that he was not. And right now, sitting with that question, right now is when we need to go back further than the television show, further even than the books, to the place where all of this actually began. Not Winoka, not Walnut Grove, not the perfectly lit prairie of the opening credits. We need to go back to the real family, the documented one, to 5 children born across 12 years on a moving frontier, to a man with a fiddle, and a woman who kept a clean kitchen in conditions that would defeat most people today, to the place where the actual story, harder and stranger and more interesting than anything television produced, was being lived. But before we do, I want to plant something in your mind, a question we will return to. If the adopted children never existed, if Albert and James and Cassandra and Nancy are entirely the inventions of a television writer's room, then why does it feel like such a loss to say so? Why does the correction feel, even now, even with all the evidence laid plainly on the table, like something is being taken away rather than something being restored? Hold that question, because the answer to it is the answer to something much larger than a television show. It is the answer to what stories are actually for, and we will find it, but not yet. The deeper history is waiting. Here is something that nobody warned you about when you first picked up those books, Laura Ingalls. Wilder was not a journalist. She was not writing a deposition. She was not attempting to give you the unfiltered, unglamorous, court-certified truth of what happened to one family on the American frontier between 1867 and 1885. She was writing a story, and she understood, with the sharp, clear-eyed instincts of a woman who had been observing human nature for 6 decades before she put a single word on paper, that a story which tells everything is not always a story that anyone wants to hear, so she made choices. Some of them were small, some of them were breathtaking, and together, they produced something that became one of the most widely read accounts of pioneer life in American history, and one of the most carefully edited ones. This is the part of the Ingalls story that most people never get to. The part that lives not in the published books with their clean moral arcs and their warm amber light, but in an earlier, rawer document. A document that sat in a box for decades, passed between a mother and a daughter and a literary agent in New York, rejected by every publisher who saw it, quietly gathering dust while the polished version of the same life was being read by millions of schoolchildren across the country. That document was called Pioneer Girl. And what it reveals about the distance between the life Laura Ingalls Wilder actually lived and the life she chose to write about is one of the most fascinating editorial stories in American literary history. It started in the early 1930s. Laura was in her mid-60s. Almanzo was in his mid-70s. The apple orchard at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri, was producing well that year, which was a mercy, because the Depression had arrived and the world outside the Ozark Hills was unravelling in ways that made the quiet rhythms of a working farm feel less like deprivation and more like a form of grace. Laura had been writing for decades already. Columns for the Missouri Ruralist, practical essays about farm life and poultry, and the nature of women's work on the land. She was not a novice. She knew how to shape a sentence, how to pace an argument, how to make a reader feel that the person writing to them was worth trusting. But she had never attempted anything on this scale, a full account of her childhood, the whole of it, from the big woods of Wisconsin to the open Dakota prairie, told straight through in adult prose for an adult audience. She sat down at her table in the farmhouse and she wrote it by hand. What came out was Pioneer Girl, and it was nothing like the books you read as a child. The manuscript that Laura produced in those early drafting sessions was honest in ways the published novels are not. It contained episodes that her editor, which is to say, her daughter Rose, immediately recognised as problematic for a children's audience. There was a saloon fight that Laura had witnessed as a child. There were details about a hired man at one of the family's various homes that were not suitable for schoolroom consumption. There was a frank account of financial failure that cut against the myth of the self-reliant pioneer family in ways that even a sympathetic publisher would have struggled to market in 1932. Rose Wilder Lane, by this point, was a far more professionally established writer than her mother. She had published novels, travel journalism, a biographical novel based on Jack London's life, a biography of Herbert Hoover. She had lived in Albania and in Paris and in San Francisco. She was, in the literary landscape of the early 1930s, a known quantity, a professional with contacts and a reputation and a working knowledge of what publishers wanted and what readers would accept. Laura gave Rose the manuscript, and Rose went to work. The relationship between these two women over the years of the Little House series, roughly 1930 to 1943, is one of the most contentiously debated topics in Wilder scholarship. Not because there is any real doubt about the basic facts. The letters between them survive. The successive drafts of the manuscripts survive. The evidence of Rose's editorial hand is visible to anyone who looks at the progression from Pioneer Girl to the published novels. The debate is about what to call what Rose did, whether it was editing in the ordinary sense, tightening sentences, correcting grammar, shaping structure, or whether it was something more, something closer to co-authorship, in which Rose's literary instincts and her political ideology shaped not just how the story was told, but what the story was understood to mean. The truth, as best as the scholarship can reconstruct it, sits somewhere in between those two poles, and it is considerably more interesting than either extreme. Here is what the manuscript trail shows. When Laura first wrote Pioneer Girl, it was a single continuous narrative, not divided into separate books, not organised around individual ages or individual homes, but running straight through from childhood to marriage in one dense sequential account. Rose prepared a clean manuscript version, and through her literary agent Carl Brandt, submitted it to New York publishers in New York and watched it get rejected. Not once, multiple times. Publishers in the early 1930s were not looking for a full adult memoir of frontier childhood. The market for that kind of book was uncertain. But one editor at Harper Brothers saw something in the material. Not in the adult version, in a potential children's version. A story for young readers, focused on the very earliest years, set in the big woods of Wisconsin, gentle enough for a classroom. Rose took the Wisconsin section of Pioneer Girl and reworked it. Reworked is perhaps too modest a word. She restructured it around a child narrator, smoothed the rougher edges, shaped the moral lessons with the particular precision of someone who understood that children's literature in the 1930s needed to do specific cultural work. She sent it to Harper. Harper accepted it. Little House in the Big Woods was published in 1932. Laura Ingalls Wilder was 65 years old, and the series that followed, 8 books across 11 years, was built on the same foundation. Laura wrote. Rose-shaped. The books went to Harper. The books went into classrooms. 4 of those 8 books received Newbery Honour recognition. The series became, within a decade, a canonical account of pioneer American childhood, so authoritative that it is still being taught today. But here is what the process of building those books required. It required leaving things out. The Kansas episode is a perfect example of what the published books chose not to say, or rather, what they chose to frame in a way that made the silence comfortable. In 1869, Charles Ingalls moved his family from Wisconsin to southeastern Kansas, Montgomery County, about 10 miles southwest of Independence, on land that the Ingalls family had absolutely no legal right to occupy, because it was not open settler land. It was the Osage Reservation. The Osage Nation, whose reservation covered the land Charles Ingalls chose for his new homestead, was in the middle of treaty negotiations with the federal government at exactly the time the Ingalls family arrived. The 1869 to 1870 period was one in which the Osage were being pressured to cede their remaining Kansas land and relocate to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. While those negotiations were ongoing, the land was not legally available for settlement. Charles Ingalls, along with hundreds of other squatters who flooded into the area in the same years, did not wait for the negotiations to conclude. He built a house, he broke ground, he started farming. By at least February 1870, federal scrutiny of the area had intensified, with government officials and Osage bands eventually gathering at the Drum Creek Council grounds in Montgomery County to negotiate the treaty that would seal the fate of the reservation. The treaty was signed in September 1870. Those who had made settlement prior to the opening, as Charles Ingalls had, were required to make payment of $1.25 per acre for their land by July 15th, 1871. The Ingalls family left in the spring of 1871 without completing that payment. The Osage were ultimately removed to Indian Territory. The land was opened. Other settlers came and stayed and built towns that still exist today. But Charles Ingalls was not there to see it. He had already left, taking his family back to Wisconsin, having spent nearly 2 years on land that was never legally his to begin with. Little House on the Prairie, the second book in the series, published in 1935, tells a version of this story, but it tells it through the eyes of a very small child who is too young to understand the political and legal reality of what her family is doing. The Osage appear in the book. There is a scene involving Osage men who come to the house. There is Pa's complicated, paternalistic and historically uncomfortable assertion that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, a line that has generated significant scholarly and public debate in the decades since the book's publication, and that led, on June 23, 2018, to the Association for Library Service to Children voting 12-0 to remove Laura Ingalls Wilder's name from a major children's literature award, renaming it the Children's Literature Legacy Award. But the books, for the most part, present the Kansas episode as adventure rather than trespass. The squatting is not named as squatting. The illegal occupation of Osage land is framed as the natural westward movement of a family seeking a better life, which is how Charles Ingalls likely understood it himself, and which is precisely the kind of framing that a particular version of American identity requires in order to function. Now, none of this is to say that Laura Ingalls Wilder was a villain. She was not. She was a woman born into a specific time and a specific culture, shaped by assumptions about land and settlement and the nature of progress that were held by virtually everyone around her, and she wrote from inside those assumptions rather than outside them. The Pioneer Girl Project and Caroline Fraser's Prairie Fires both acknowledge this complexity without turning it into a simple condemnation. But it matters. It matters because the books are presented as autobiography, because generations of readers were taught to trust them as a more or less accurate account of what frontier life was like, because the distance between what the books say happened and what the historical record shows happened is not just a matter of narrative polish. It is, in certain places, a matter of whose story is being told and whose is being left out entirely. The Osage who lived on that land before Charles Ingalls arrived do not have names in the book. They do not have faces in the way that Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura have faces. They move through the narrative as a kind of atmosphere, present, threatening, ultimately removed, and the story continues without them. That removal, in the books, is seamless. In history, it took soldiers, treaties, and the forcible displacement of a people from land their nation had held for generations. These are not the same thing. But let us come back to the books themselves, because there is another layer of the myth-making that is worth examining closely before we move forward, and it is one that affects the story of the fictional adopted children directly, even if the connection is not immediately obvious. One of the most iconic characters in the Little House series is a girl named Nellie Oleson. Nellie is the antagonist of the Plum Creek years and the De Smet years, spoiled, vain, condescending, the daughter of a town merchant who looks down on farmers in general and on the Ingalls in particular. She is the character that an enormous percentage of Little House readers identify as their primary villain, the girl they loved to hate, the foil against whom Laura's frontier virtue shines most brightly. She is also, definitively and provably, not a real person. Nellie Oleson was a composite character, constructed from 3 separate girls from Laura's actual childhood. Nellie Owens, who lived near Plum Creek in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, and whose father did run a store. Genevieve Masters, who was from the same Minnesota community and was given to bragging about her connections to the East. And Stella Gilbert, who lived near De Smet in Dakota Territory, and who had a history of complicated social interactions with both Laura and Almanzo. Laura took characteristics from all 3 of these real women, merged them into a single fictional character, gave her a name that was half borrowed from the first of them, and placed her across from Laura in a series of confrontations that the books present as something close to the moral spine of Laura's childhood story. None of the 3 real women were exactly like the fictional Nellie. Nellie Owens, by some accounts, was genuinely unpleasant as a child, though she grew up to live a full and unremarkable life. Genevieve Masters and Stella Gilbert were more complicated figures, real people with real lives that extended far beyond the few scenes in which Laura used them as narrative raw material. But by the time the books were published, all 3 had been collapsed into a single villain, and the villain was more satisfying, more dramatically useful, and more memorable than any of the 3 real women could have been individually. This is what Laura Ingalls Wilder was doing, systematically and skillfully across the entire series. She was not transcribing her life, she was transforming it. She was doing what every great storyteller does, finding the shape inside the experience, cutting away what did not serve the shape, and presenting the result with enough surface texture of authenticity that the audience would trust it as real. And she was not doing it alone. Rose Wilder Lane's contribution to the Little House series is a subject that some Wilder devotees have historically resisted, because it complicates the image of a self-taught frontier woman sitting alone at her farmhouse table, producing a beloved literary classic through sheer force of memory and love. The reality is richer and stranger than that image. Rose was, by the time she began working on her mother's manuscripts in earnest, a committed libertarian whose political philosophy centered on individual self-reliance, the danger of government dependency, and the particular American virtue of the person who succeeds through their own effort without institutional support. She would go on, in the 1940s and 1950s, to become one of the founding figures of the modern American libertarian movement. Alongside Ayn Rand and Isabel Patterson, the 3 women scholars have called the intellectual architects of post-war American anti-statism. These were not abstract convictions for Rose. They were the lens through which she read her mother's life story, and quite possibly, the lens through which she shaped the editorial choices that transformed Pioneer Girl into the Little House series. The published books, as scholars including Caroline Fraser have noted, consistently emphasize self-reliance and family independence. They consistently minimize or omit evidence that the Ingalls family received government assistance, which they did, in the form of land grants that were the direct product of federal Indian policy. They present a family that succeeds through its own virtue and effort, in a landscape that is portrayed as essentially empty and available, rather than as land that had been taken from people who had lived on it for generations. Whether this is Rose's ideology shaping the narrative, or Laura's own beliefs already moving in that direction, or some combination of both, is the kind of question that literary scholarship can illuminate but never fully resolve. What is clear is that by the time the books reached the public, they told a specific kind of American story, and they told it persuasively enough that it became, for millions of readers, the story of the American frontier itself. Now here is why all of this matters for the question of the fictional adopted children. Because the pattern established by the books, the pattern of selective truth, of shaping the raw material of experience into something more emotionally satisfying and more ideologically coherent than the facts alone could provide, did not stop with the books. It continued into the television show. It continued in a different direction, with different motivations, but the essential mechanism was the same. Laura had already established that the Ingalls story was a story about a family defined by its virtue, its resilience, and its love. She had already established that this was a family that was better, kinder, more principled than the world around it. She had already established that Pa was the ideal frontier father, patient, strong, generous, devoted. Michael Landon took that established ideal and asked the natural next question. If Pa is the ideal father, if Charles Ingalls is the man who always does the right thing, who always finds room in his heart for one more person in need, then what happens when a child in desperate need appears in front of him? The answer, in the world the books had already constructed, was inevitable. He takes the child in. The television show did not invent the myth of Charles Ingalls as an infinitely generous father. Laura Ingalls Wilder invented it first. The television show simply followed the myth to its logical conclusion, and in doing so, departed from the history that the myth had been built on top of. There is one more thread in Laura's own reshaping of her life story that we need to examine here, because it connects directly to the larger question this video is asking. In Little House in the Big Woods, the first book, the Wisconsin book set in the early 1870s when Laura was only 3 or 4 years old, there is a boy, not a fictional adopted child, a real cousin. His name was Charlie, and he was the son of Uncle Henry and Aunt Polly. And in a chapter called Harvest, Laura describes an episode during the fall harvest at Uncle Henry's farm that is so precisely detailed, so vivid in its particulars, that it reads like a passage from a documentary rather than a children's novel. Charlie had been playing tricks all day, pretending to be stung, crying out, watching the adults drop their work and run to him, and then laughing when they discovered there was nothing wrong. He did it once. He did it twice. He did it enough times that when he eventually stepped into a yellow jacket nest, a real one, with real yellow jackets swarming up around his legs and his waist and his arms, nobody moved. They heard him screaming and they thought, "There he goes again." By the time anyone realized this was not another trick, Charlie had been stung dozens of times. He was covered in stings from ankle to shoulder. The family packed him in mud to draw out the venom, wrapped him in a sheet, and sat with him through the night while he suffered the consequence of having used up all the credit of his own distress cries on false alarms. He survived. But the lesson that Laura draws from this episode, and the fact that she draws a lesson at all, that the story is shaped so deliberately toward a moral point about the cost of dishonesty, tells you something important about what Little House in the Big Woods actually is. It is not a photograph. It is a portrait, carefully composed, carefully lit, with the subject placed exactly where the painter wants them, and the background arranged to make the point that the painter has decided to make. Charlie is real. The yellow jacket nest is real. The detail of the mud and the sheet and the grown men and women not running when he cried out. Those details have the grain and texture of actual memory. But the story, as Laura tells it, is a shaped thing, assembled with purpose, functioning within a larger architecture of values and lessons and emotional truths that the book is designed to deliver. This is what literature is. It is not a failure of honesty. It is an exercise of craft. But understanding it as craft, understanding that every episode in every Little House book is a shaped narrative rather than a verbatim transcript of experience, changes how we read the books. It changes what questions we are allowed to ask. It opens the door to asking not just what happened, but what was left out, and why, and whose story the leaving out served. And here is where the story that has been running quietly underneath everything we have discussed tonight finally surfaces into the light. Because there is a person in the Ingalls family history who was left out not just from the books, but from nearly everything. A person whose existence disrupts the clean, warm, self-reliant family portrait that both the books and the television show spent decades constructing. A person who lived inside the real Ingalls household during some of the years covered by the books, and whose life tells a story about the limits of frontier family mythology that neither Laura nor Michael Landon was equipped, or perhaps willing, to tell. His name was not Albert, it was not James or Cassandra, and it was not Nancy. The story of who this person actually was, and what their presence inside the Ingalls family reveals about everything we have been discussing, is the story we're going to tell next. Pick up that thread from where we left it. At the end of the last chapter, we were standing at the edge of something. A presence in the Ingalls family story that neither the books nor the television show was equipped to fully carry. A person, or more precisely 2 people, whose lives cut directly across the warm, self-reliant, tidy mythology of the Little House world, and asked a question that mythology has never been comfortable answering. What do you do with the men who came back broken? We need to go back to Wisconsin in 1864. Not the Wisconsin of the big woods, not the Wisconsin of the dancing and the fiddle music, and the pig's bladder blown up like a balloon for the children to play with. The other Wisconsin. The Wisconsin of a country in its 4th year of the bloodiest war it had ever fought, where the mail from the front arrived in envelopes that families were afraid to open, and where the question of who was going to be drafted was no longer theoretical, but immediate and personal and terrifying. Charles Ingalls was 28 years old in 1864. He did not enlist. That fact is documented, and it is not a condemnation. Men had their reasons, and Charles had a wife and a growing family and land obligations that kept him where he was. But his brothers did not stay home. His brother James was 21 years old. His brother Hiram was 16, though Hiram, who was apparently not a boy who let a number stand between him and a decision he had already made, told the enlisting officer he was 19. Think about that for a moment. A 16-year-old boy standing in front of a Union Army officer at Lake City, Minnesota, in the winter of 1864, lying about his age by 3 years in order to be accepted into a war. Hiram Ingalls was not a character in a novel. He was a child by any modern reckoning. And he walked into that enlistment office and came out a private in Company E, 1st Regiment of Minnesota Heavy Artillery. James walked in behind him, because that is what older brothers do. In the first days of January 1865, James Lansford Ingalls and Hiram Lemuel Ingalls were mustered into Company E, 1st Regiment Minnesota Heavy Artillery, at Lake City, Minnesota. Their company was sent south in late February to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Their assignment was garrison duty, guarding the forts and the heavy guns positioned around a city that the Union had taken from Confederate forces in the fall of 1863 after a campaign that had cost thousands of lives on both sides. Here is the first thing you need to understand about what garrison duty at Chattanooga in 1865 actually meant for the men assigned to it. They did not fight. The 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery was not a combat unit in the traditional sense. They were not charging up hills or holding lines against infantry assaults. They were standing guard. They were maintaining fortifications. They were doing the daily, grinding, a largely invisible work of military occupation. The hauling and the drilling and the standing watch and weather that went from brutal summer heat to damp, bone-cold nights in camps that were crowded with men from across the Midwest who had been thrown together by the arithmetic of conscription and had to find ways to survive in close quarters, eating whatever the army's supply chain managed to deliver, and sleeping in conditions that military medicine of the era was entirely inadequate to address. And they were getting sick. Disease was the great killer of the Civil War, not the mini-balls and the artillery shells, though those killed plenty. Disease killed more Union soldiers than Confederate weapons did, and in garrison units like the 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery, where combat casualties were minimal, Disease was almost the only way the war touched you physically. Dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia. The medical records of Civil War garrison units read like catalogues of everything that a 19th century immune system, under sustained stress, inadequate nutrition, and constant exposure to contaminated water, could succumb to. The 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery lost 87 men to disease during its service, without firing a single shot in battle. 87 men. The regiment did its job, stood its watches, guarded its fortifications, and buried its dead in the Tennessee soil without a single engagement to show for it. There was no glory in this. There was no dramatic last stand put in a regimental history. There was just the slow, and quiet attrition of men being used up by the conditions of military service and coming home, those who came home, carrying whatever the service had put inside their bodies. Hiram Ingalls was mustered out at Nashville in September 1865. He was discharged at Fort Snelling, Minnesota on September 27, 1865. He was 17 years old. He had spent the better part of a year guarding artillery emplacements in Tennessee and had come home to Wisconsin with the rank of private, the same rank he had entered with, and whatever memories the service had given him. He lived until 1923. He died in Danbury, Wisconsin, of chronic dilation of the heart and pneumonia. The word chronic tells you something if you know how to read 19th century medical language. Chronic conditions in the records of Civil War veterans are almost always connected to service. The heart that has been overstressed, the lungs that were compromised by a winter in a garrison camp in Tennessee, the body that came home already running at a deficit it would spend the next several decades slowly paying down. Hiram had 6 children. His obituary in the Burnett County Enterprise notes his military service in a single sentence. 18 months in the 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery, and then moves on. That is how most of these men were remembered, when they were remembered at all. A single sentence, a rank, a regiment, the number of months, and then the rest of their lives, folded back into the ordinary fabric of the Midwest without further comment. Now look at what the books did with this. Little House in the Big Woods was set in the early 1870s. By that point, both James and Hiram Ingalls had been home from the war for 5 years. They were grown men in their mid-20s and early 30s, living their post-war lives somewhere in the Wisconsin and Minnesota landscape that the Ingalls family moved through. And in the published books, the Little House novels that went into classrooms and onto bookshelves and into the hands of millions of children, James and Hiram are not there, not mentioned, not named, not present at the dances or the harvests or the holiday celebrations that the books depict in warm, specific detail. The brothers who had actually put on Union Blue and gone south to stand watch in Chattanooga, the ones whose service is documented in the National Archives and Company E muster rolls, are absent from the story entirely. But Uncle George is there. Uncle George, whose name is George Whiting Ingalls, and who appears in a little house in the Big Woods at the dance at Grandpa's house, in a blue army coat with brass buttons, blowing a bugle and dancing with what the books describe as a certain wildness that frightened small Laura. The books say George had run away to serve as a drummer boy in the army when he was 14 years old, and in Pioneer Girl, Laura's original unpolished adult manuscript, she adds a detail that didn't make it into the children's version. George, after the war, stole a cow. He was arrested, and Pa, according to Laura's own account, said, "What could you expect of a boy who had joined the army when he was 14 and lived off the country all those years?" That is not the Charles Ingalls of the television show. That is a harder man, making a harsher judgment, in a world where the cost of the war was not a dramatic sacrifice but a practical problem. A brother who came back wrong, who could not settle, who took things that weren't his and caused trouble and made people uncomfortable. The Pioneer Girl Project, after systematically searching Union Army rosters, found no Civil War service record for George Whiting Ingalls. None. He is not on the muster rolls. He is not in the pension files. He is not in any document that the federal government generated to track the men who served. James and Hiram are on every Company E roll call. George, as far as the historical record can establish, did not serve. Let that sit for a moment, because it opens a door onto something genuinely strange in the architecture of how this family understood itself. The brother who is documented as having actually served, who actually left Wisconsin as a teenager, who actually went to Tennessee, who actually stood guard in Chattanooga, and came home with whatever the service had done to his body, he is not in the books. Not even in the background. Not even as a name at a holiday table. The brother who appears to have no service record at all, who the archives cannot find in any Union Army file. He is the one in the blue coat. He is the one with the bugle. He is the wild man at the dance, the cautionary tale Pa tells with his head shaking. The living evidence of what the war does to boys who go too young and stay too long. There are a few ways to read this, and none of them are simple. One possibility is that Laura genuinely believed the family story about Uncle George, and did not know or did not have access to the muster roll records that would have contradicted it. Family oral histories are notoriously unreliable about military service. Men embellished, men minimised, and in the years after the Civil War, when the cultural pressure to have served was considerable, a family might easily construct a veteran narrative around someone who had not served and quietly omit the ones who had. Another possibility is that James and Hiram's service was too ordinary, too unglamorous to serve the narrative purposes that Uncle George's story served. A boy who ran away at 14 to be a drummer boy is a story. A 21-year-old and his 16-year-old brother who enlisted and spent months guarding artillery emplacements in Tennessee and came home sick, that is not a story. That is just what happened to men. And a third possibility is that what happened to James after the war was something the family did not want to examine too closely. Something that the warm, self-reliant mythology of the Little House world had no framework to contain. Because James Lansford Ingalls came home from Tennessee, and what followed him home was not glory. The pension records, which are federal documents, filed with the government by veterans and their families, preserved in the National Archives, tell a partial story. They tell the story through the language of 19th century medicine, which means they tell it in fragments and euphemisms and clinical descriptions of symptoms without always naming what caused them. But the fragments add up to something. James came home with a chronic service-connected illness. The specific nature of that illness runs through the pension file in terms that suggest persistent gastrointestinal damage, the kind of thing that a man develops after months of garrison life in a camp with inadequate sanitation and irregular, insufficient food. Think about what that meant for a farmer, a man whose entire livelihood depended on his physical capacity to work the land, to plant and harvest and haul and build, in a region where the margin between a good year and a failed year was measured in the quality of the labour a family could put into the ground. James Lansford Ingalls came home from the war with a body that could not reliably do the work that his life required of it. And unlike the dramatic, visible wounds of a combat veteran, the missing limb, the sabre scar, the injury that everyone could see and understand and assign a story to, the kind of illness James carried was invisible. There was nothing to point to. There was just a man who was frequently unwell, who could not always do what needed doing, who needed more help than a self-sufficient frontier family was supposed to need. This is the cost that the books do not carry. Not because Laura was dishonest, exactly, but because the Little House books were written to show a family that prevailed, a family that worked hard and endured and came through on the other side. The narrative architecture of the series depends on that prevailing. It depends on Pa being strong, on the family being self-sufficient, on the frontier being a place where virtue and effort are eventually rewarded. A brother who came home from the war with a broken body and a pension file full of medical complaints does not fit inside that architecture, so he is not there. Now connect this to the larger question we have been building toward all evening. The television show invented 4 children that Charles and Caroline Ingalls never had: Albert, James, Cassandra, Nancy, and presented them in the context of a story about a family defined by its generosity, its expansiveness, its willingness to take in whoever needed them. But the books, which preceded the television show by 40 years, had already performed a different but equally significant act of editorial selection. They had taken a family that included 2 Civil War veterans, men whose service had left marks on their bodies and their lives and their relationships, and constructed around that family a narrative that made those marks invisible. The result was a family portrait that showed everything that was beautiful about the Ingalls world: the love, the resilience, the music, the specific sensory richness of life lived close to the land and quietly omitted everything that complicated that beauty. The men who came back sick, the brother who allegedly stole a cow, the illegal occupation of Osage land, the government assistance that made the homesteading possible in the first place. The television show, decades later, looked at that portrait and saw a family with unlimited capacity for love and service. It saw Charles Ingalls as a man who always had room for one more child in his heart. And it built its mythology directly on top of that, extending the logic of the books to its emotional conclusion. Both mythologies were wrong in different ways, and both were built on the same foundation, the deliberate, skillful, sometimes painful choice of what to leave out. Here is where the story opens up into something that has nothing to do with Laura Ingalls Wilder or Michael Landon, or the archives of the 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery. Something universal. Something that belongs to every family that has ever sat around a table and told its own story, deciding, consciously or not, what goes in and what stays out. Every family does this. Every family has its Uncle George, the figure who gets the blue coat and the bugle and the romantic narrative, and it's James and Hiram who served faithfully and came home changed and were gradually written out of the version of the story the family told itself. Every family has the edit. The question is never whether the edit exists. The question is what it cost, who was erased by it, whose suffering was made invisible because it did not fit the shape of the story the family needed to believe about itself. In the Ingalls family, as best as the historical record can reconstruct it, the edit cost James his presence in the books. It cost Hiram his presence in the books. It cost the Osage their presence in the books, except as atmosphere. It cost the hired girls and the seasonal labourers who passed through the family's various homes their presence in the books. It cost the infant Charles Frederick, Freddie, his full story, giving him barely a mention despite being a child who was born and who lived and who died. The edit cost all of these people their place in the most widely read account of frontier family life in American history. And in return, it gave millions of readers something that they needed badly and genuinely. A story about a family that held, a father who was strong, a mother who was steady, a childhood that was hard but beautiful and that meant something, a version of American experience that felt worth having. This is the bargain that mythology always makes, and it is always made in the dark, without the consent of the people who are left out. There is a detail in the Pioneer Girl Project research that I want to give you before we move forward, because it is the kind of detail that, once you know it, you cannot unknow. In Laura's unpublished Pioneer Girl manuscript, the raw, unpolished account that preceded all the books, there is a fragment in which a small girl asks her uncle a question. The uncle, in the context of the manuscript, appears to be connected to the war. The question is about something she has seen or heard that she does not understand. And the uncle's answer, preserved in that manuscript fragment, is 3 words. 3 words that do not appear anywhere in the published Little House series. 3 words that were part of the original draft and did not survive the editorial process that transformed Pioneer Girl into the books. Yet we do not know with certainty which uncle this was. We do not know exactly what the question was. The fragment is incomplete, the way that early drafts are always incomplete, raw and contextual, requiring the rest of the manuscript to make full sense. But it is there, in the drawer with the unpublished manuscripts, in the box that sat for decades while the polished version of the same life was being read by millions of children. 3 words that a little girl was told, and that the books decided the rest of the world did not need to hear. Now look at where all of this was headed, because 1879 arrives in the middle of it. Mary Ingalls went blind in 1879, at the age of 14. The books say it was scarlet fever. That was what the family understood at the time, and it was what Laura carried into her account of those years. But in 2013, a research team at the University of Michigan published a study in the journal Pediatrics that examined the historical and medical evidence surrounding Mary's blindness with considerably more rigour than anyone had previously applied to it. The researchers, working from newspaper reports of Mary's illness, from Laura's own letters to Rose written around the time of By the Shores of Silver Lake, and from epidemiological data on blindness and infectious disease in the late 19th century American Midwest, concluded that scarlet fever was probably not the cause of Mary's blindness. The more likely cause, based on the evidence available, the severe headaches, the partial facial paralysis, and the language in Laura's letter describing some sort of spinal sickness, combined with records of a local physician who noted that the nerves of Mary's eyes were dying, was viral meningoencephalitis. Meningoencephalitis is an inflammation of the brain and its surrounding membranes caused by a viral infection. It can cause neurological damage, including damage to the optic nerves, that results in permanent blindness. The distinction matters not just medically, but narratively. Scarlet fever, caused by a bacterial infection, spread easily in communities with close contact, was a disease that happened to you, a bad luck event in the history of a childhood. Meningoencephalitis involving the brain and spine was something more serious, more frightening, more suggestive of the kind of illness that leaves marks beyond the eyes. The books gave Mary a clean narrative cause, scarlet fever, the Prairie, bad luck, and moved forward. The medical record suggests something more complicated, something that, in the context of a story already shaped toward resilience and forward motion, would have been harder to carry. We are going to stay with Mary for a moment, because her story connects directly to the question of the television show's adopted children in a way that is not immediately obvious, but that becomes clear once you see it. Mary Ingalls was real. Her blindness was real. The Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton, Iowa, to which she went in 1881 and where she spent roughly 7 years learning, was real. And it was not a free institution. The Ingalls family paid for Mary's education there, in addition to everything else they were managing at the time. For they were in De Smet, Dakota Territory by then, in a town that was barely 3 years old, on a homestead claim they were still trying to prove up, in a landscape that had just delivered the most catastrophic winter in living memory, the hard winter of 1880 to 1881. They paid. And the way they paid, in part, was that Laura left school at 15 to take work as a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse 9 miles from home, teaching children who were in some cases barely younger than she was, sending her wages home to help cover Mary's school fees. She was 15 years old, teaching school in a Dakota winter. The books describe this period by the shores of Silver Lake and Littletown on the Prairie, and these happy golden years cover these years in Laura's life with the same careful specificity that characterizes the rest of the series. So the economics are not hidden. You can feel the pressure in the pages, the weight of what the family is managing. But the books frame it as a story of capability, of a girl who rose to the occasion, of a family that found a way. What the books do not dwell on is how close the family was during these years to not finding a way, how thin the margin was, how dependent on contingency, on a good harvest, on Laura keeping her teaching job, on De Smet not having another catastrophic winter on top of the last one, their survival actually was. The television show's Charles Ingalls in these same years was adopting children. The real Charles Ingalls, in these same years, was moving his family from one failing homestead to the next, watching his eldest daughter lose her sight, and relying on his second daughter to earn money they could not generate themselves, and doing all of it in a Dakota Territory that had proved considerably less hospitable than he had hoped. These are not incompatible facts. They are the same family, the real one, the one the books loved, and the television show loved, and millions of readers loved, and who was also struggling, failing in certain moments, dependent, human in all the ways that the mythology around them was not quite equipped to honour. There is something I want you to carry forward from this chapter into everything that comes next. The men who came back broken, James and Hiram Ingalls, the documented veterans, the ones the archives confirm, were not tragic figures in the way that fiction makes tragic figures. They did not die young and beautifully. They did not collapse in a single memorable scene that everyone could point to and say, "There, that is where the story turned." They just kept going. They farmed when they could. They filed their pension papers. They had children. They lived in small Wisconsin and Minnesota communities that did not record their experiences in any form that has survived. And eventually they died, of conditions that their service probably contributed to. in circumstances that did not make the newspapers or the histories or the books. This is what most of the cost of any war looks like. Not the monuments and the medals, not even the named graves, but the men and women and children who kept going afterward, quietly, in bodies and lives that had been quietly altered by what they had been through, in ways that the culture around them could not see or did not want to see. The books gave that invisibility to James and Hiram and gave Uncle George the blue coat. The television show gave that invisibility to the real limits of the real Ingalls family and gave Charles Ingalls Albert. The architecture is different, but the mechanism is the same. And now that you can see the mechanism, now that you can see exactly how both the books and the show built their versions of the Ingalls family by choosing what to light and what to leave in the dark, we are ready to ask the hardest question of all. Not what was erased, not by whom or why, but what the erasing cost the people who were doing it. Because Laura Ingalls Wilder knew things about her uncles, about the Kansas land, about the gap between the story she was telling and the life she had actually lived. She was not a naive woman. She was not a careless one. She was an extraordinarily intelligent person who had spent 6 decades observing the world with the particular precision of someone who would eventually commit that observation to paper, and she sat down at her table in Missouri and made her choices. What that felt like from the inside, what it cost to be the person who holds the real story and chooses the shaped one, is the question we have been circling all evening. We're about to go right to the centre of it. There is a date you need to keep in mind as we move forward. March 30th, 1974. That is the night NBC aired the pilot movie of Little House on the Prairie for the first time. A 2-hour film that drew what Nielsen records indicate was a 26.2 rating and a 45 share, meaning nearly half of all televisions on in America that night were tuned to a covered wagon crossing a creek on the open prairie. The regular weekly series that followed it premiered on September 11th, 1974. Laura Ingalls Wilder had been dead for 17 years. The Pioneer Girl manuscript was in an archive. The Little House books were in classrooms and on library shelves, and in the hands of millions of readers who, by 1974, included people who had themselves been given the books by parents who'd read them as children. The series was already a generational inheritance by the time the television cameras arrived. Ina and 30 million Americans turned on their sets and watched. 1 in 7 people in the entire country. Not because the pilot was spectacular television by the standards of the era, not because it broke new narrative ground or offered something formally daring, but because the story it was drawing from had already done decades of quiet work in the American imagination, and Michael Landon, who was simultaneously the star, the producer, and increasingly the primary creative force behind the series, understood what that work had built and had a precise, intuitive sense of what an audience wanted when they turned on the television after dinner and needed the world to feel manageable. What they wanted in 1974 was a father who knew what to do. America in 1974. You have to understand what the country looked like the year Little House premiered, because the television show was not made in a vacuum, and it was not answering an abstract question about the frontier. It was answering a specific emotional need that a specific historical moment had created. 1974 was the year Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency in August, the first and only time an American president has done so. It was a year deep inside the social and political turbulence that had begun in the 1960s and showed no signs of resolving. The women's movement, the civil rights movement, the lingering trauma of Vietnam, the counterculture, the collapse of a post-war consensus about what American institutions could be trusted to do and who they served. The divorce rate was climbing. The nuclear family as a social structure was being publicly challenged from multiple directions simultaneously. And into this landscape, NBC sent Michael Landon onto the prairie in a covered wagon with a fiddle and a family. The timing was not accidental, even if no one in the writers' room sat down and said, "We're going to make a show that heals the national anxiety about fatherhood and family structure." These things rarely happen consciously. They happen because a skilled storyteller reads the room, reads what the audience is carrying, and finds the story that fits the shape of what needs to be said. The story that fit was Charles Ingalls. Specifically, the version of Charles Ingalls that Michael Landon built from the material Laura had provided, warmer than the historical man, yes, more consistently wise than the real man's record supports, possessed of an emotional intelligence and an expansive capacity for compassion that the book suggested but the show amplified into something almost theological. This par could handle anything, and crucially, this par could take in anyone. For the first 3 seasons, Little House on the Prairie stayed reasonably close to the geography of Laura's books. The Ingalls family in Walnut Grove, the tension between the Ingallses and the Olsons, Laura in school getting into trouble, competing with Nellie, Pa building things and solving problems and coming home with his fiddle, Mary being blind and going to the Iowa school and becoming, in the show's telling, someone whose faith and dignity made her blindness a vehicle for grace rather than simply a limitation. The historical family structure, 5 biological children, economic precarity, a father who moved frequently and a mother who bore the cost of those moves, was simplified but not yet radically transformed. The show was expansionist in its emotional register without yet being expansionist in its literal family census. That began to change in Season 4. By Season 4, the children who had been central to the early seasons were aging out of the childhood that the show was built to portray. Melissa Sue Anderson, who played Mary, had moved into the teenage years and was increasingly focused on an acting career that would eventually take her away from the series. Melissa Gilbert, playing Laura, was growing up on camera in a way that inevitably shifted the story's centre of gravity. The younger Ingalls children, Carrie, and all Grace, were real, but minor. The series had a structural problem that every long-running family show eventually faces. Children grow up. The engine of the narrative stalls. Michael Landon's solution was not to shift the show's focus to a different life stage. It was to add children, new ones, children who are still young enough to be at the centre of the family drama that the show ran on, who could arrive with their own backstory and their own needs, and give Charles Ingalls someone new to save. Albert Quinn, Ingalls, Season 5. Episode 1. As Long as We're Together. 1978. Albert Quinn is an orphaned boy living on the streets of Winoka, Dakota Territory, surviving by his wits in a way that the show presents as both resourceful and tragic. A child who has been failed by every institutional structure that should have caught him, finding his way through life with the particular battered competence of someone who stopped expecting to be helped. Charles meets him. Charles sees him. And in the grammar of this television show, which has been running for 5 seasons on the understanding that Charles Ingalls is a man whose greatest gift is his capacity to recognise need and respond to it, what happens next is not surprising. It is, in fact, the only thing that was ever going to happen. Charles takes the boy home, not immediately as a formal adoption. The arc builds over multiple episodes, as the show's storytelling always did, the crisis and the doubt and the eventual resolution that arrives with a score of piano and fiddle. But ultimately, in the logic of the series, Albert Quinn becomes Albert Quinn Ingalls, and Michael Landon, who played Charles, is on record as being personally invested in the Albert storyline in a way that went beyond professional interest. He had, in his own complicated biographical history, some understanding of what it meant to be a child who needed someone to step in. The audience responded with the full weight of everything they had been carrying since 1974. Albert's arc, the street child taken in, the addiction storyline that arrived later when the actor Matthew Labyorteaux was old enough to carry heavier dramatic material, the illness arc near the end of the series, became some of the most watched television of the late 1970s and early 1980s. But here is what you need to hold on to as the emotional truth of Albert's story settles in your chest the way it always does when you remember those episodes. The National Archives of the United States contain the census records, the land records, the church records, and the family correspondence that document the actual Ingalls household through every decade of its existence. Albert Quinn Ingalls is not in any of them. He was born in a writer's room. His name is not on a single muster roll or census line or land claim or family letter. He did not exist, and yet for the 40-plus years since Season 5 aired, he has existed in the memory of everyone who watched him, with the specific emotional weight of a child who was loved into belonging, which is to say, with a reality that the historical record cannot touch, because it operates in a different register entirely. This is the thing about invented characters that carry genuine emotional truth. They do not need to have happened to be real. The question is not whether Albert felt real. He did. The question is what gets displaced when the invented child occupies the space where the historical record is silent, and what the choice to invent him says about what America in 1978 needed a frontier family to look like. The Lost Ones, James and Cassandra Cooper. Season 7, May 1981. The two-part episode, The Lost Ones. A wagon accident, orphaned children, siblings, a boy named James, and a girl named Cassandra, who lose their parents on the road, and are, through the series of coincidences and kindnesses that Little House specialised in engineering, brought into the orbit of Charles and Caroline Ingalls. The casting of these children was partly driven by a practical reality. Melissa Sue Anderson had decided to leave the series. The show needed to maintain Charles as a father figure at the centre of a family with young children. The Cooper siblings arrived as the solution. What the writers did with James and Cassandra was different from what they had done with Albert, and the difference is worth examining. Albert's story was principally about Charles, about a man with the capacity to love a child who was not his own, to absorb a complicated and sometimes difficult person into his family without conditions, to be the father that this child had been denied. Albert's arc was the arc of rescue. James and Cassandra's arc was the arc of grief. They were children who had watched their parents die. They were not street children operating at a remove from conventional family life. They were children who had known a loving family and lost it in an instant, and who carried that loss through every episode they appeared in, not as backstory but as an ongoing presence. A wound that the Ingalls' warmth could hold and comfort, but not entirely close. This was, in narrative terms, more sophisticated than Albert's introduction had been. It was asking the audience to sit with a kind of grief that the original Little House books had always handled obliquely. The specific grief of children who have lost parents. A grief that the frontier produced in enormous quantities, but that the books, with their tightly nuclear family focus, rarely put at the centre of the frame, and it asked Charles and Caroline to be not rescuers, but witnesses, to hold space for a loss they could not fix, which was a somewhat different emotional demand than the one the Albert arc had made. The audience responded. James and Cassandra became beloved fixtures of the later seasons, and they do not appear anywhere in the historical record of the Ingalls family, not in the census, not in the letters, not in Pioneer Girl, not in any archive that the Pioneer Girl Project, Caroline Fraser, or any other scholar has been able to locate. They were invented as Albert was invented to serve the story that the television show needed to tell in 1981. Nancy, the mirror villain. And then there was Nancy. If Albert was the rescue fantasy and the Cooper children were the grief arc, Nancy was something else entirely. A commentary on the adoption narrative itself, though not one the writers necessarily intended. When the original Nellie Olson character married and left the series, yet the show needed a villain who could occupy the structural role that Nellie had played since season 1, the spoiled, antagonistic child who existed to be the foil to Laura's generosity and work ethic, the embodiment of everything the show's moral universe was arguing against. The solution was Nancy, a girl adopted by the Olsons beginning in season 8, specifically to replace Nellie in the narrative ecosystem. She was presented as manipulative, difficult, performatively helpless. A child whose behaviour was so contrary to the Ingalls' virtues of honesty and industry that her very presence was a walking argument for the superiority of the family that was defined by giving and the inferiority of the family that was defined by having. Here is the uncomfortable thing about Nancy. The thing that distinguishes her from Albert and from James and Cassandra in a way that matters beyond the narrative mechanics. Albert was an invented adopted child who validated adoption. James and Cassandra were invented adopted children who validated adoption. Nancy was an invented adopted child who problematized it. A girl whose adoptive family was the villain family, whose difficult behaviour was framed as a nature problem rather than a nurture problem. A child who was coded from her first episode as fundamentally unlike the family that took her in, and not improvable by that family's love. The show that had spent 3 seasons establishing that love could transform an orphan street child and grief could be carried and held and survived. That same show, in its final seasons, introduced an adopted child who was simply bad and stayed bad. The scholars who have examined this arc note carefully what it implies. The Ingalls adopted children were savable because they were fundamentally good. The Olsen adopted child was not savable because she was fundamentally not. The show's adoption mythology, it turned out, was not a universal argument about love transforming all children. It was a targeted argument about what love could do for the right kind of child in the right kind of family. Nancy has no counterpart in the books. She has no counterpart in the historical record. She was born in a writer's room, like everyone else in this chapter, but her story tells you more about the ideology underneath the adoption arcs than Albert's story does. Because in Albert's story, everything worked out. In Nancy's story, you find the limit of what the show actually believed about rescue. Let's step back from the individual characters and look at the structural logic. Between 1978 and the early 1980s, Little House on the Prairie introduced 4 invented children into the Ingalls and Olsen households, Albert, James, Cassandra, Nancy, and used each of them to tell a story that the original books could not tell, because the original books had a historical family at their centre, and historical families have fixed membership. The book's Charles Ingalls had 5 children. He could not acquire more without departing from the record Laura had established. The television show's Charles Ingalls had no such constraint. He was a character in a drama, and the drama needed what it needed. What it needed, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was a father figure with unlimited capacity, not unlimited wealth. The show was meticulous about the Ingalls' economic precarity, the crops that failed and the debts that pressed, and the way Pa's plans did not always work out. The economic difficulty was part of the show's credibility, part of what made the audience trust it as a portrait of something real. But unlimited emotional capacity, a father who could always find room for one more, a mother whose love did not run dry, a family defined not by biological specificity but by willingness, by the open door, by the table set for whoever needed a place at it, by the understanding that family is not what you are born into but what you choose to make. This is a beautiful idea. It is also, in the context of the actual Ingalls family history, a myth layered on top of a myth. The real Charles Ingalls was a man who moved his family 9 times in search of economic security he never quite found. He was a man whose eldest daughter's blindness required his second daughter to leave school at 15 to earn wages for the family, a fact that the television show translated into Mary's inspirational journey at the Iowa school without fully reckoning with what Laura's interrupted education had cost. He was a man who occupied land he had no legal right to occupy, who accepted government assistance the ideology of his books made it impossible to acknowledge, whose brothers had served in a war that left permanent damage in their bodies, brothers whose service is documented in federal archives and whose names do not appear anywhere in the books that made the Ingalls family famous. This man, this actual, specific, historically documented man, did not have unlimited capacity. What he had was a family that loved each other fiercely within very real limits, a family that endured, but not without cost. A family whose story, told in its full complexity, is more remarkable than the mythology, precisely because it was achieved by people who were genuinely limited, who failed sometimes, who needed help and could not always ask for it, who built something beautiful out of conditions that should have broken them. Michael Landon took that family and made the limits disappear. He gave Charles Ingalls Albert. He gave the audience the father it needed in 1974 and could not find in the world it was actually living in. The fan communities and the long confusion. Here is a consequence that nobody planned for and nobody could have predicted in 1978. For the generation that grew up watching Little House on the Prairie in its original broadcast run, and for the subsequent generations that encountered it in syndication in the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, through streaming platforms that now carry all 9 seasons. The distinction between the television characters and the historical family is not always clear. It is often not clear at all. Fan communities on Reddit and other platforms regularly host debates about Albert, James, and Cassandra that treat them as historical questions. Did Albert really have a drug addiction? Did the Coopers really die in a wagon accident? What happened to Nancy after the show ended? These questions are not asked about the fictional characters of a television drama, with the understanding that fiction is fiction. They're asked about people who feel, to the people asking, like they were real, like they are part of the actual history of the Ingalls family, waiting to be researched and verified and placed correctly in the timeline. The power of the television show to overwrite the historical record in popular memory is not a small thing. It is one of the most significant examples of what media scholars call the substitution effect, the process by which a sufficiently persuasive fictional representation of a real event or person gradually displaces the documented record in the minds of the audience that encounters both. Laura Ingalls Wilder had already performed one version of this operation. The Little House books had already shaped how the American public understood frontier family life in ways that the historical record does not fully support. The television show took that already shaped understanding and added another layer of shaping on top of it, and the result was a palimpsest, a document written on top of a document written on top of a document, with the actual historical family somewhere at the bottom, increasingly difficult to read through the accumulated layers of memory and myth. The Pioneer Girl Project, which began its formal work in 2009, and Caroline Fraser's Prairie Fires, published in 2017, represent the scholarly effort to peel those layers back, not to destroy what was built, not to tell people that what they loved was worthless, but to show the original document underneath, the real family with their real limits in their real landscape, and to argue that the actual story is worth knowing, that it is in fact more powerful and more instructive and more humanly true than either layer of mythology that covers it, and the actual story does not have Albert in it. It does not have James or Cassandra. It does not have Nancy. It has Charles and Caroline and Mary and Laura and Carrie and the infant Freddie, who lived 9 months and 26 days, and Grace, the youngest, the one who appears in the books as a small golden-haired presence and who died on November 10th, 1941, in Manchester, South Dakota, as a farmer's wife with a long life behind her that nobody has written much about. And it has, in the years after the books ended, Laura and Almanzo's unnamed infant son, who lived a day shy of 4 weeks before he died of convulsions in the summer of 1889. It has a family of exactly 5 children, all biological, all documented, whose lives were shaped by forces that neither the books nor the television show could fully hold. Economics and weather and government policy and the cost of westward expansion on the people who were already there, and the Civil War brothers who came home carrying it in their bodies, and the Laura who sat at a table in Missouri and made her choices, and the Rose who shaped those choices and was never fully credited for it, and the gap between all of it, and the story that 60 million children read in the 20th century and loved. That gap is not a failure. It is an invitation. Every gap in a mythology is an invitation to look at what was left out and ask why. And the why, in the case of the Ingalls family and the Little House franchise and the 4 invented children of the NBC television show, is the same why it always is. Because the full truth was too complicated for the container the story was being poured into. Because the audience needed something the full truth could not cleanly provide. Because mythology is not dishonesty, it is selection. It is the human insistence on organising experience into shapes that can be carried, shapes that mean something, shapes that outlast the winter. The real Ingalls family survived their winters. The television show invented children to give Charles Ingalls new winters to survive, new people to carry through them, and millions of viewers sat in living rooms across America, week after week, and watched him carry them, and felt, in the particular way that great television makes you feel, that this was true, that this was how it had been, that out there on the prairie, a century before they were born, a man had held the door open and let the children in. They were not wrong that such men existed. They were only wrong about the specific man. And the distance between those two things, between the man who existed and the man the show built, is the distance this entire story has been travelling. We're almost at the end of it. But before we get there, we need to go back one final time. Not to the television show, not to the archive, Not to the writer's room in 1978 or the Pioneer Girl manuscript in 1930 or the Company E muster rolls of the 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery. We need to go back to Missouri, to a woman at a table, to the moment when Laura Ingalls Wilder sat down with her school tablets and her pencil and began to write the first sentence of the first book, the sentence that would become the foundation of everything that came after it, the books and the show and the mythology and the invented children and the archival reckonings and the award and the renaming and the 30 million viewers and the 500 people who came to Rocky Ridge Farm on the first day. It was open to the public and needed to see where it had all started. She wrote, "Once upon a time." She wrote it in the full understanding that once upon a time is what you say when you're about to tell the truth in the shape of a story. Not all of the truth. Not the year in Burr Oak. Not the dead infant son. Not the brothers who came home from Tennessee with their bodies running at a deficit. Not the Osage land. Not the hired girls. Not the government assistance that made the homesteading possible. But the truth that she chose to carry. The truth that fit the shape she needed it to fit. And the question, the real question, the one that has been underneath everything we have said tonight from the first chapter to this one, is not whether that choice was right or wrong. It is what it cost her to make it. The woman at the table was 63 years old. The year was 1930. The place was a farmhouse on a rocky hillside in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri, near a small town called Mansfield. Outside, the Great Depression had just begun its decade-long march across the American economy, and in Wright County, Missouri, the Depression's arrival was not so much a sudden shock as a deepening of conditions that had already been difficult. The farms around Mansfield operated close to the margin in good years. In 1930, the margin had simply vanished, and the people who worked those farms were doing what they had always done when the margin vanished. They kept going. They did the work. They fed the animals and tended the land and came inside at dark and got up again the next morning because there was no other option that made sense. Laura Ingalls Wilder had been keeping going in exactly this way for 4 decades. She had done it with a husband who was partially disabled, on a farm that had taken 17 years to build into something dependable, through financial setbacks that would have pushed a less stubborn woman to a different life entirely. She had written columns for the Missouri Ruralist and a local paper, practical observational pieces about farm life and women's work, without anyone thinking of her, including herself, as a writer in the literary sense. And then, in 1930, she sat down with a stack of school tablets and a pencil and began to write about being a child. The manuscript she produced in those first months was called Pioneer Girl. It was 74,000 words long. It covered her entire childhood, not just the warm and beautiful parts, but all of it. The year the family lived above a saloon in Burr Oak, Iowa, the hardship of the Walnut Grove years, the infants who died, the land in Kansas that the family had no legal right to occupy, the full geography of a life that had been, by any measure, extraordinary in its difficulty and extraordinary in its texture and entirely unsuited, in its rawest form, to the audience that would eventually love it most. The manuscript was rejected by publishers, not because it was poorly written, it was not, but because the market for adult pioneer memoirs in 1930 was limited, and because the rawness of it, the honesty that made it invaluable as a historical document, was also what made it commercially uncertain. What happened next is where the story becomes the most complicated thing we have told you tonight. Rose Wilder Lane was Laura's only surviving child. She was 43 years old in 1930, and she was, by any reasonable measure, a more successful writer than her mother had ever been. She had published novels. She had written a biography of Herbert Hoover. She was a nationally known journalist who had ghostwritten the life stories of Charlie Chaplin and Henry Ford. She was a woman of considerable intellectual ambition and considerable political conviction, a libertarian who was already developing the framework that would eventually make her one of the founding voices of the American libertarian movement, alongside Ayn Rand and Isabel Patterson. She read her mother's Pioneer Girl manuscript and understood immediately what it could become. Not the adult memoir it currently was, a children's series, a series of books that took the memories Laura had poured onto those school tablets and shaped them into something a child could carry, could love, could read and reread until the pages wore soft. She began to help her mother shape the first book. The degree to which Rose did more than help, the degree to which she rewrote, restructured, and in some passages effectively created material from her own imagination, rather than from her mother's memories, has been the subject of one of the most heated debates in American literary history. William Holtz, a professor of English at the University of Missouri, spent 15 years comparing Laura's original manuscripts with the published books and published his conclusions in The Ghost in the Little House in 1993. He argued that Rose Wilder Lane had, in any honest accounting, ghost-written all 8 Little House books published during her mother's lifetime. That the transformation from Pioneer Girl's flat chronological prose to the shaped, rhythmic, literary narrative of Little House in the Big Woods was not a development that Laura's own craft could explain. That Rose's hand was everywhere, in the scenes, in the structure, in the ideological framework that gave the books their particular quality of argument about self-reliance and the virtuous frontier family. Carolyn Fraser, in Prairie Fires, pushed back. Not to deny Rose's substantial contribution, Fraser acknowledges the extensive collaboration and Rose's powerful editorial influence, but to argue that treating Laura as merely a vessel for Rose's creativity was an oversimplification that dishonoured both women. That the memories were Laura's, that the emotional authority of the books was Laura's, that Rose was a shaping force, a substantial and crucial one, but that the creative origin was the woman at the table with the pencil, and that the collaboration, however unequal and however contested, was a genuine partnership rather than a ghostwriting arrangement. The mainstream scholarly consensus, 60 years after the books were published and 30 years after the debate became public, is that both women deserve credit and neither deserves sole authorship. The books are the product of a collaboration between a woman with irreplaceable memories and a woman with professional literary craft, and the tension between those two things, the memories that needed to be true and the craft that needed to shape them, is precisely what makes the books as good as they are. But that tension had a cost that the books themselves never show you. Here is what the collaboration between Laura and Rose actually looked like from the inside. Laura would write, she would produce the raw material, scenes, sequences, memories reconstructed with the particular sensory precision that characterized her mind's relationship to the past. A woman who could remember, 60 years later, the exact smell of the big woods in autumn, the exact sound Pa's fiddle made in a specific cabin, the exact quality of light on the Dakota prairie at a particular hour of a particular season. Rose would receive the pages. She would rewrite them, sometimes lightly, adjusting rhythm, clarifying a scene, tightening a sentence, sometimes substantially, restructuring entire episodes, adding details that her mother had not mentioned, shaping the material toward the ideological argument that both women, for different reasons, wanted the books to carry. And Laura would see the changes. What it felt like to be Laura Ingalls Wilder in those moments, to receive back from your daughter a version of your own memory that had been reshaped by someone else's hand, is a thing the historical record can only partially reconstruct. The letters between mother and daughter from those years are preserved in archives and have been studied carefully by scholars. What they show is a relationship of enormous complexity, affection and friction simultaneously present. Rose frustrated by her mother's resistance to certain changes. Laura frustrated by the liberties her daughter took with material that was, at its core, hers. There were fights, not violent fights, not the kind that end relationships, but the sustained friction of two strong women with different investments in the same project, working at a distance. Rose was in Connecticut, Laura in Missouri, through the mail. Letters that carry the weight of conversations that could not be had face to face. Disagreements about what was historically accurate. Disagreements about what a particular scene should emphasize. Disagreements, perhaps most fundamentally, about whose story the books actually were. Rose never sought public credit for what she had done. This is one of the most striking facts of the entire collaboration. A woman who was a professional writer, who had ghostwritten for Henry Ford and Charlie Chaplin and other famous figures, who understood exactly how much work she was putting into the Little House books. She allowed her mother's name to appear alone on every cover. She did this for complicated reasons, not all of them selfless. The books were commercially valuable, and the value was connected to the persona of Laura Ingalls Wilder as their sole author. Complicating the authorship would have complicated the value. There were also political dimensions. Rose was using the books in part as vehicles for the libertarian ideology she was developing, and a transparent ghostwriting arrangement would have undermined the book's authority as authentic personal memoir. But there was something else too, something that is harder to name but that sits underneath all the pragmatic reasons. Rose loved her mother. It was a complicated love, the kind that carries as much frustration as tenderness, the kind that can sustain 15 years of editorial labour precisely because the stakes are so high on both sides. She wanted the books to succeed. She wanted Laura to have the recognition. She wanted something she had given enormous amounts of her own creative energy to produce to reach the audience it deserved. She kept the secret, and Laura kept it too. The collaboration with Rose shaped what went into the books, but Laura's own choices, made before Rose ever saw the pages, made in the act of deciding what to write down and what to keep inside, shaped them equally. We have already travelled through the erasures in the earlier chapters of tonight's story: the Civil War brothers, the year in Burr Oak, the infant Freddie, the Osage land. But we have not yet looked at the cost of those erasures to the woman who made them, and that cost is the thing this chapter is about. Laura Ingalls Wilder was not a person who was unaware of what she was doing when she selected which memories to make public and which to fold back into silence. She was an intelligent, observant woman who had spent 60 years watching the world, with the precision of someone who understood that detail is where truth lives. She knew what she was omitting. She knew why she was omitting it. She knew, for instance, that the land in Kansas, the land where Pa had built the little house on the prairie, the land that the books depicted as free and open and waiting, was not empty. It was the Osage Indian Diminished Reserve. The Ingalls family had arrived there as illegal settlers on land in Montgomery County, Kansas, roughly 10 miles southwest of Independence. The Osage were negotiating the sale of their last Kansas reserve under conditions that Congress shaped and controlled. At a September 1870 meeting, the Osage leaders stated explicitly that they would not sign a new treaty unless white settlers were first removed from their land. The Osage were led off their Kansas reserve in the fall of 1870. The route they took was close to where the Ingalls family was living. A small girl in a little house on the prairie would have seen or heard that passage, would have experienced, through a child's perception, some version of the reality that the books later rendered as the distant sounds of Indian ponies and the shadowy figures that made young Laura afraid. What the books do not contain is any framework for understanding what the Osage were losing, any recognition that the land the Ingalls family wanted was land that people were being forced to leave, any sense that the story had another side, not a villainous side, not a side that makes Charles Ingalls a monster, but simply a human side, the side of the people who were already there. Laura was 5 years old when the Ingalls family lived on Osage land. She did not have the framework, at 5, to understand what she was witnessing, but she was 63 when she wrote about it, 65 when the book was published. She had 60 years of adult experience and adult perspective between the events and the page, and she wrote what she remembered, filtered through what she chose. The Osage people in Little House on the Prairie appear as figures of fear and spectacle. Viewed through the window of the little house, heard in the darkness beyond the settler's claim, understood only in the terms that a white settler child in 1869 would have understood them. The Osage Nation itself has published documentation addressing the myths and realities in the book's portrayal. The scholarly literature on what Laura saw and what she rendered, and the gap between those two things is substantial. Laura knew the gap was there. She had lived on both sides of it, as the child who experienced it and as the adult who wrote it. And she chose to write the child's perception without the adult's retrospective understanding, not because she was careless, because the book she was writing was a child's book, told from a child's perspective, and introducing the adult reckoning would have broken the perspective she had chosen to maintain. This is a craft decision. It is also a moral one. and it is not a simple one. In the summer of 1954, the American Library Association placed a bronze medal in Laura Ingalls Wilder's hands and told her that her name would go on an award for children's literature, a recognition that would be given to the best authors of children's books in the years that followed. She was 87 years old. She put the medal in a drawer. It stayed there. In June 2018, the Association for Library Service to Children's Board voted 12-0, unanimously, to rename the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award to the Children's Literature Legacy Award. The standing ovation in the conference room in New Orleans lasted for a full minute after the vote was announced. The primary reason cited was the anti-native and anti-black content in the Little House books, not as incidental or ignorable elements, but as structural features, ways of seeing built into the books at a level that could not be separated from the warmth and the craft. The Osage people rendered as frightening strangers on what the narrative implied was already white settler land. The black characters in Little House on the Prairie, who appear in a brief and troubling episode that scholars have analysed at length. A worldview that, in the view of the ALSC board and a significant portion of the professional library community, did not belong on a living award given to contemporary authors as a standard of excellence. 1. The decision was not without controversy. Some argued that removing her name was an erasure rather than a reckoning, that the books could be taught critically, with honest discussion of their limitations, without requiring that the honour be stripped from a woman dead for 60 years, that using a living award as the instrument of a posthumous judgment was a category confusion, punishing an author for the limits of her era by removing her from a conversation she was no longer alive to participate in. Others argued that keeping her name on the award was itself a statement, that every year the award was given in her name, it was saying, "This is what we mean by a lasting contribution to children's literature, and this woman is the standard we are measuring against." And that a standard which embedded the erasure of Indigenous people into its foundation was not a standard the profession should be holding up, regardless of the quality of the prose. Both of these arguments deserve respect. Neither of them is stupid. The complexity of the debate is itself evidence of the complexity of Laura's legacy, evidence that a woman who died in a farmhouse in Missouri in 1957, having put her medals in a drawer, made something that was powerful enough to generate serious moral argument more than 60 years after she was gone. She would not have liked the argument, probably. She was a private woman who found public controversy uncomfortable, and who had spent her life managing with great care what picture of herself the world had access to. She would not have anticipated, in 1930 when she sat down with those school tablets, that the book she was writing would still be generating legal motions and board votes and standing ovations in conference rooms in New Orleans in 2018. But she built something that lasted, and the things that last are the things that the world keeps working on, keeps pressing from new angles, keeps finding new edges in. There is one last silence that belongs to this chapter. One more thing that Laura Ingalls Wilder knew and chose, with full deliberateness, to keep inside. She had written a 9th book. Not a book about her childhood, and not the collaborative project she had built with Rose across the 1930s and early 1940s. A book about the first 4 years of her marriage to Almanzo Wilder, the years that began exactly where these happy golden years left off, at the moment of their wedding on August 25th, 1885, and ran through the disasters of their early life in Dakota Territory. She wrote it in the early 1940s, while she was in her mid to late 70s, still living at Rocky Ridge with Almanzo, while the Depression had finally ended and the country was entering a new and different kind of difficulty. She wrote it in the same pencil, on the same school tablets, in the same kitchen where she had written every other word she had ever published, and she never sent it to her publisher. The manuscript, which was found in her papers after her death and published in 1971 as the first 4 years, covers the diphtheria that partially disabled Almanzo for the rest of his life, the infant son who lived a day shy of 4 weeks, the house fire in 1889 that destroyed what they had built, the crop failures that came one after another, each one taking something they could not replace. The year in Spring Valley, Minnesota, where they lived with Almanzo's parents because they had no other option. It is not a book about triumph. It is not a book about families that hold together through hardship and find the spring on the other side of the winter. It is a book about two young people who did everything that the Little House mythology said you were supposed to do. Worked hard, stayed together, maintained their faith, refused to quit, and still lost. Still came to the end of 4 years with less than they had started with. Still needed someone else's charity to keep going. It does not fit. It does not fit the architecture of hope that the other 8 books were built on. It does not fit the ideological argument about self-reliance that the collaboration with Rose had threaded through every chapter of the series. It does not fit the story that America, in the 1930s and 1940s, needed the Ingalls family to tell. She wrote it anyway. Because it had happened. Because those 4 years were part of her life, and she was a woman who believed, at some cellular level, in the importance of writing down what was true, and she kept it in a drawer. Scholars who have studied this decision read it differently depending on their focus. Some argue the manuscript was simply not ready, that without the editorial collaboration with Rose, the writing lacked the polish of the published series, and Laura knew it. Others argue the content itself was the reason, that the failure arc of the 4 years was simply too contrary to the mythology she had spent over a decade building. But there is a third reading, one that does not require choosing between craft and content as the explanation. Laura kept the manuscript in the drawer because it was entirely only hers. The published Little House books were hers and Rose's, collaborative objects, shaped by 2 intelligences and 2 agendas and 60 years of combined experience and 15 years of postal argument and mutual admiration and mutual friction. They were real. They were the best thing either woman had produced. But they were not solely Laura's. The first 4 years was solely Laura's. Every word on those school tablets was what she remembered, without any other hand on it. The diphtheria was in there exactly as she had lived it. The dead son was in there exactly as she had buried him. The fire was in there exactly as she had watched it take everything. No shaping toward the ideological argument. No compression of the painful years to keep the narrative moving toward the light. Just the true record, raw and unrevised, of what those 4 years had actually been. She did not want that one published. Not in her lifetime. Not in a market that would receive it as a Little House book, and would expect it to carry the warmth and forward motion of the others. Not under conditions where its failure without redemption would be read as a departure from the mythology, rather than as an honest record that had always existed beneath the mythology. She left it for whoever came after her to find. Which means she intended it to be found. Laura Ingalls Wilder was not a careless woman who simply forgot about a manuscript in a drawer. She knew where everything was. She kept the manuscript there on purpose, a deliberate act of preservation for a later reader, someone who would approach it without the expectations of the series, someone who might understand it on its own terms. She was right about the reader. The scholars who have studied the first 4 years since its 1971 publication have understood it exactly that way, as a private record that illuminates everything the published series chose to leave in the dark. We have been in this story for a long time now, 6 chapters. We have travelled from a Wisconsin dance hall with a fiddle to a Tennessee garrison camp where the brothers came home sick. From a Kansas prairie that belonged to the Osage to a Dakota Territory winter so severe that the town ground seed wheat in a coffee mill to survive. From the school tablets where Laura sharpened her pencil in 1930 to the writer's room where Michael Landon invented 4 children who never existed in 1978. From the drawer where the medal sat to the drawer where the manuscript sat. All of it, in the end, circles back to the same question. What does it cost to be the person who holds the real story and chooses the shaped one? The answer that the whole arc of Laura Ingalls Wilder's life suggests. The answer written across the manuscripts and the letters, and the collaborations and the drawers full of unpublished truths, is that it costs exactly what you would expect it to cost, and that the people who pay that cost do so because they believe, or have decided to believe, that what the shaped story provides is worth what the real story loses. Laura believed that. She shaped her childhood into something children could carry to bed and love and return to. She accepted that the shaping required omissions, the Osage land, the dead brothers, the Burr Oak year, the years of losing, and she made the omissions deliberately, thoughtfully, without pretending they weren't omissions. The evidence of this is everywhere if you know where to look. The Pioneer Girl manuscript is the evidence. The drawer with the first 4 years is the evidence. The letters to friends in South Dakota that said simply, "I am very lonely, not for public consumption, not shaped, just true." She kept 2 records simultaneously, across her entire writing life. The public one, shaped, selected, crafted toward hope, carrying the mythology that America needed and that she was genuinely capable of building, went into the books and into the classrooms and into the hands of generations of children who loved it, who needed it, who carried it with them into adulthood and passed it to their own children. The private one, raw, unrevised, carrying the omissions and the failures and the grief that the public record could not hold, stayed in the drawers, in the manuscripts, in the silences between the sentences, in the year in Burr Oak that the published series jumped over without acknowledging, in the brothers whose names the books did not carry, in the 4 terrible married years that she wrote down and could not send out. Both records were real. Both records were hers. She did not destroy the private one to protect the public one. She kept both, and she trusted that eventually someone would be able to read them together, not as contradiction, but as complement. The full picture, requiring both records to exist. The Pioneer Girl project gave us that ability when it published the annotated autobiography in 2014. Caroline Fraser's Prairie Fires gave us that ability in 2017. The archival work of the Pioneer Girl project scholars, the historians who searched the first Minnesota heavy artillery muster rolls, the researchers who documented the Osage land, all of them, working for decades on different pieces of the same story, have given us the ability to hold both records at the same time and see the whole shape. The whole shape is larger than the mythology. It is also more human, more honestly about what the frontier cost and who paid and what was lost and what was built on what was lost. It contains the warmth of the published books, and it contains the coldness that the published books were designed to hold at bay. It is both things simultaneously, and it requires you to hold both things at once, which is harder than holding just the warmth or just the critique. This is what it means to reckon honestly with a legacy, not to replace the mythology with a counter-mythology. Not to replace Laura Ingalls Wilder, the pioneer saint, with Laura Ingalls Wilder, the settler colonialist, but to look at the actual person, the woman at the table in 1930 in Missouri, with her pencil and her school tablets and 60 years of memory, and understand what she was doing and what it cost her and what it gave us. A Rocky Ridge farm is still there. You can visit it today. You can walk into the farmhouse on a highway outside Mansfield, Missouri, and stand in the kitchen that was built to the height of a woman who was not tall. You can look at the writing desk. You can feel the floors creak under your feet the same way they creaked under hers. The orchard is still on the hill above the house. The grave at Mansfield Cemetery is still there, with Almanzo beside her and Rose beside him, and somewhere in the museum that holds the physical evidence of what she built, in the glass cases with the manuscripts and the letters and the small bronze medals she kept in drawers, is the proof that one woman turned a difficult life into something that has been read by hundreds of millions of people across 90 years. She was born in a log cabin in Wisconsin in 1867. She sat at a table in Missouri in 1930 and began to write about it. The books that came from that table are still selling. The mythology they built is still being argued over, still being taught, still being loved, still being challenged, still being read to children at bedtime in houses across the country, where people who do not know anything about the 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery, or the Osage Diminished Reserve, or the first 4 years in a drawer are simply encountering for the first time the story of a little girl and her father's fiddle and the sound of wolves on the prairie at night. That encounter is real. The love it generates is real. The thing it gives to the people who receive it is real. And so is everything the mythology was built on top of. The brothers who came home carrying the war, the land that already had people on it, the years of failing, the daughter who shaped the pages, the drawer that held what could not yet be said. All of it is the story, the whole story, the one that Laura Ingalls Wilder spent her entire life telling, partly in the books and partly in the silences between them. This is where the full story lands. Thank you for spending tonight in this history with us. The farmhouse is still there, so are the drawers, so is everything she left inside them.